Welcome to Thrive at Work, a podcast which offers insights and latest employment trends to help employers attract, retain and develop great people with me, Polly Rathbone Ward. With special guests, we're going to be discussing the many and varied aspects of HR, from practical topics to overarching cultural themes. We'll be looking beyond traditional styles of management to bring new and people-centred ideas to forward-thinking organisations that want to shape a new future where people can thrive at work. Hello, I'm so delighted today to be joined by Zoe Thompson. Zoe and I met each other pre-pandemic, so it must be a few years ago, at a networking event. And there are some similarities between what we do, and we just always end up having fantastic conversations. So I'm so delighted that Zoe has given her time and is joining me today. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So Zoe runs Phoenix Life and Wellbeing Coaching, and you've done that for a little while. Zoe, do you want to just start by explaining a bit about your background, what you've done up to date, and sort of how you've come to do what you do and what you offer to clients?
Okay, so I've been running Phoenix for just over 4 years now, so in year 5. Prior to that, I worked for the police for 20 years in a variety of different roles. So I started up at the bottom of the ladder, so to speak, in reception, inquiry office roles, and worked my way up through the organisation into senior leadership roles. And the last role that I had in the organisation was in change management, but I also had a side role of self-development trainer, and was also coaching and mentoring other leaders coming up through the organisation. So I was in a really privileged position to be, although I wasn't a police officer, so I was police staff, but I did have management responsibility for police officers, which was quite new in the organisation. And so there were other individuals coming up through into those leadership roles that were looking for support, because it just had a different dynamic to it. So I was made redundant in 2017, and when I looked at the options, obviously I could look for employment elsewhere, but when I looked at what I was really enjoying in the roles that I had done, for me the coaching element was really kind of encompassed everything that I enjoyed: the coaching, the mentoring, the self-development training, and I was really enjoying the change management role as well. Although it was business change management, I liked bringing people in through change and the engagement and the conversations that came out, and bringing the organisation and the people with it through change. So Phoenix was born as I was made redundant. So the day that my redundancy kicked in was the day I launched the business. And so yeah, that was 2017. So I've been coaching full-time now for a few years, and I work with individuals, young people and adults. The line that I like to use is I help them to create the tomorrow that they want while learning to love their today. That's really important for me. I think it's great to have a vision and a future and live the life that you do want, but also it's really important to find and appreciate and love what you have now while you're working towards that. And it's the same ethos when I work with businesses as well. It's supporting the staff through workshops. Quite often there's soft skills based or well-being based workshops to support the staff, but also one-to-one support with their leaders. We know, don't we, at the moment, that there's this change in what we're expecting and what we're needing from our leaders. And so being able to support them through workshops to help them with the frameworks and the strategies to help with that, but then through coaching sessions, helping each individual, what that means to them and how they can utilize that with the teams that they work with.
That's great. Gosh, thank you. There's a lot of information there. That's fab. I love what you were saying about helping people to create the tomorrow that they want. Whilst, what was the second bit?
While learning to love their today.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people get really focused on what they don't have, while they're working on what they do want. And so it's being able to balance the both, being able to balance what you already have, what you've already achieved, what life has already given you, and still working towards more of what you want, and being able to make those changes to have and live that life that you do want, rather than a life that has happened to you or a life that other people perhaps have wanted for you.
Absolutely. And I think it's as well, it's about kind of being present in your now, gratitude and the mindfulness of, recognizing what you have now while making small steps, small changes to improve things for yourself, taking control really, and
Absolutely.
helping yourself to move towards, what you ultimately would like to achieve in the future. That's wonderful. Thank you. Gosh, I feel like, as ever, these conversations that we have go in any direction. Yeah, there were quite a few topics that I was thinking about for our conversation. And what I thought we could sort of delve into a little bit more is around the area of change, because I know that change management has been in your background, and the climate we're in right now, and we've been through for the last 18 months, we have all experienced such a huge amount of change. So from my perspective, I'm seeing, employers wanting to support their employees through change. I mean, that's been the case for the last 18 months, but we're now in a transition now at the time of recording, where employers are either, asking people to come back to the office, or kind of transitioning to a sort of hybrid working, depending on the sort of situation and what kind of business it is. So I thought change would be a good area for us to focus on. So when you were with the police, what sort of change management were you actually kind of dealing with?
The first project or program that I worked on was actually a restructure of the organization. So with budget changes, government changes, we had to make a crazy amount of savings, and it couldn't be done through the usual process of going through an organizational chart and just taking out the roles that weren't needed or combining roles. It needed a complete restructure, and within that there was some collaboration with other forces as well. So I think the size of the program, I think we looked at 1 in 3 staff were impacted. So it was a huge program, changing the restructure, looking at how things were done, what was working, what wasn't working, how policing had changed since the last operating model had been in place. So it was a huge program, and a program of engagement as well, of trying to understand from the people on the ground what was working, what wasn't working, what changes did they see, but also then trying to put that into a big picture of putting all of these roles and all of these departments in together. So that was my first introduction into sort of the project world of change management. And then after that, I worked on different sort of smaller projects, but the last one that I worked in was we brought in a new computer system, so technology change, which impacted everybody, but you obviously have more people, some people that are more confident with technology, some people really welcomed it, other people resisted it. And then the last one that I did was the technology rollout, so the body-worn cameras, using a policing app on their mobile, laptops, so being able to support the teams that are out with the public, being able to work without having to come back into the station. So lots of different projects, and all of them had a slightly different dynamic in how it impacted each individual and how it impacted each department. And so the engagement with individuals was the role that I had as business change manager, was being the link between the people on the ground doing the job, the people that were being impacted, linking into sort of the senior kind of top table, and trying to connect to and make sure that the messages weren't lost as they went up through the chains of command, if you like.
So important, I think, the communication and how that's managed, isn't it? And I think, as soon as anyone gets a note of something's happening, change is happening, people get very nervous. And we've been through obviously a huge period of uncertainty throughout the pandemic, and people, I do think, get very, very nervous about, they're not, they're used to coming to work every day. Well, there have been times when, things have been so uncertain that, they're not sure if they're going to have a job next week, next month, what's going to happen. And I think uncertainty is very difficult for us to deal with, isn't it?
It is. And I think there's a difference between when we feel change is happening to us, being forced on us, to when we're welcoming a change that we want to happen. It's a very different dynamic. It feels very different to us as an individual, doesn't it? And when we feel like a change is being forced on us, especially if we don't see the benefit of the change, or we don't feel like we have any control or influence over that change that is happening. So yeah, it's I think what's happened over the last 18 months, I think a lot of people have had change happen to them. And I think there's a real opportunity now to bring people in and help them to shape the change. And I think that's probably one of the key differences in change that's going to be welcomed and embraced, and people will make the most of it, to when there will be more resistance and people are going to dig their heels in a little bit more. But I think there's a real opportunity for businesses to look at how they operate, look at where their staff are at their best, and bringing their staff in and engaging their staff in what do they want from this change, using it as an opportunity rather than something that has to be done.
Great. So do you have any examples of things that you've seen that have been done particularly well or not so well?
There's always lots of examples for both. And I think what I'm seeing at the moment is, I think it's easy, for some people, a smaller organization, it feels easier because there's less people to engage with, less people to work with. But sometimes that has its own restrictions. And I think bigger companies might have more in terms of what they can do, but it's a bigger ship to turn. So I think communication is really important at the moment. And I think there's a responsibility on each team leader to really communicate with their teams and understand what individuals are wanting and needing. Two different things, I know, but understanding what they want from their company and what their company can do to support that. So I think the communication is really important at the moment, and seeing how companies are communicating with their staff, it is going to be not just at the highest level, but those individual team leaders as well. And obviously the companies that I'm working with are very much on board with understanding what their staff want and shaping what their staff want, because they bring in people like me to help them to do that. So that they're invested in wanting a good outcome. You hear some very interesting stories of how other companies are approaching it, of almost that, okay, this is the date, we can all be back at work, so we'll see you on Monday morning at 8:00, and not thinking or considering that actually people have changed their routines, they've changed how they're working. And that doesn't necessarily mean that their productivity or their performance has been impacted. So just this assumption that everything will just change and revert back. So I'm hearing some very interesting stories, but I think it's understanding, as a team leader, your individuals, how are they working at their best, and how can you support that? Because if you've got a good, happy member of staff who has found a way that works for them, then can you accommodate that? Can you bring that into your new ways of working? Why do you need to go back to how it was before? Because so many other things have changed. This is resilience, isn't it? Is it a bounce back, or is it a bounce forward? Is it taking what you've learned and taking that into the future, or is it trying to revert back to what worked before? And I don't think a lot of people want that now. I think people want elements of what they had before, but they don't want it as it was before. And I think communication is the real key here, and understanding what do your individuals want, where and how and why do they perform well, and how can you embed that into your ways of working, and how can your company accommodate that? Because if you get the best from your staff, you get the value of that as an organization. So some really good stories coming through, and some shockers too, but it's always the way, isn't it?
It is. I completely agree with you. I don't want to go back to normal. I think we need to learn the lessons from the last 18 months and move forward to a future that is fit for, well, I don't know, just a different future. I would rather move forward rather than look back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Productivity has not dipped during this time when people have been working separately. It's not to say, though, that there are those underlying issues. So, some people have not enjoyed working from home.
Mm-hmm.
Some people really miss the social interactions and the connections. And would love to get back to the office, but I think some people who, there have been huge benefits of working from home as well. So I think it's looking at, what is right for that particular business, but also for the individuals within the business.
Yeah.
I think some form of hybrid approach is probably a great way forward if that can be accommodated by the business. I agree. I think, saying, 9 o'clock, in the morning, you need to be back in the office is slightly blinkered. So yeah, really interesting. So what would you be saying to, I know that you speak to individuals very often as well through what you do in terms of your coaching. And I think you were just saying actually before we press record that there seems to be quite a disconnect between what people want and what, employers think they're doing well and right. So what would you, if you could sort of help or support some managers, team leaders, and say, perhaps consider this sort of thing, are there any sort of practical tips that you could suggest?
What I'm seeing is a slight change in how people are approaching this, and I think coaching as a method of supporting staff is perfect for this kind of scenario. And a lot of employee assistance programs have counselling or they have support services, but what coaching does is help people to look at where they are now and where they're trying to get to, which is exactly the situation that we are in. And I think a lot of companies have supported executive coaching for their leaders at the top of their organizational chart, but actually coaching team leaders, coaching those managers that are in contact with your teams of people on a day-to-day basis has that double advantage, because you're supporting the leader, but you're also supporting that leader to be able to support their staff. So, and the conversation we were having before we started recording was, the Deloitte wellbeing survey, and this disconnect between what organizations think they're providing for their staff to support them and then what the staff themselves feel is being supported. And the number that I gave you was 32% in the last survey said they didn't feel that their workplace was supporting them enough during COVID. And that's quite a big number of people. So I think the question for organizations at the moment is, do you understand what your staff want and need from support services? And if there is a lack of engagement, why is that? Is it because the services are not fit for purpose, or potentially is there a culture within your organization that means people feel uncomfortable about coming forward and using those services, which we know happens? It's not necessarily that people don't feel that those services are fit for purpose, it's whether or not they feel comfortable and confident in stepping forward and using them. So I think that's really important at the moment, is understanding, what do you provide? Is it what people want? And how can you help your people to engage with the services or shape the services into something that's needed? So I think the employee assistance programs are fantastic regardless of the size of the organization, but it is about the engagement and making sure that they're fit for purpose. And the support that people need at the moment is very different to what they needed 2 years ago. So it's checking in that those services are still fit for purpose. They might have been fit for purpose before. Are they still fit for purpose now, or do they need to be shaped? But I think coaching is not just for your high-performing executive senior managers. There's a benefit to coaching for your team leaders and your managers. And also I look after and support well-being with coaching as well, because counselling is great and so is coaching, and it's two different types of service which gives two different types of support. And so what you're doing is you're empowering that individual to make a decision of what support they want to help them to move forward.
Brilliant, thank you. You touched on redundancy earlier, and furlough has just recently come to an end. Furlough scheme that was set up at the start of the pandemic has now finally wound down, sort of 18 months later. There may be people now who are facing a very uncertain future. Employers have obviously had to think about whether they can bring people back to the office, back to the workplace, or whether they're having to look at other options because it's not viable. Obviously that is a hugely uncertain time, and you've been through it yourself. So what are there any sort of tips or anything you could say that would help that transition? Because there are good ways to be made redundant, and there are not good ways to be made redundant.
They are, and I think the biggest difference is how the people manage the people through the process. And it also depends. For me, I'd been there 20 years. You know, that was a big part of my identity. And I know, you know, people say that shouldn't be a part of your identity, but it was. You work with an organization for that long. Everything in your life is connected, you know, into that world. And I think understanding how that change impacts individuals, and it will impact different people in different ways, but supporting the individual through the process. It's not just about managing a post out of a structure chart. It's about supporting an individual to find the best next steps for them. And that will be, again, it's always different for different people, isn't it? But it's just sitting down and having that conversation with people and saying, okay, how can I support you to manage this? This isn't about taking it away from them and managing it for them, but it's asking that individual, how can I support you to take ownership of this, to help you make the decisions that are best for you? Again, it's that coaching approach, isn't it? It's not fixing it. It's not solving it for them. It's not giving them the answers. It's giving that person that safe space to talk freely about how they feel, how it's impacting them, where else it might be impacting other parts of their life, and then helping to support that individual to take ownership and responsibility and be able to move themselves through the process and take control of it. Because I think that's, for me, that was the biggest challenge, was I didn't feel in control of what was happening. And when I tried to take control of what was happening and take control of the elements of what was happening, I would find that the organization were making changes elsewhere that were having an impact on me. And so that was the biggest challenge. But I think, again, it's communication, it's listening to the individual and understanding what the individual's concerns are. You know, some people are very happy to walk away with a package and not worry about what their next steps are. And for other people, that's a huge level of uncertainty that has an impact on family and financial commitments and their confidence and their sense of purpose and their sense of contribution and their sense of significance and all these emotional human needs that we have and that we need to fulfill. So again, it does come back to communication, of having people in those positions who are able to sit down and listen and give somebody that safe space and not feel that they need to jump in and problem solve and find all the answers. Sometimes it is signposting and saying, okay, let's help you to find an organization or somebody who can help support you with this. And I'm not sure that always people who are in these positions are best placed to do that. And that then becomes part of the problem, is that individual then doesn't just feel that they're being managed out of an organization. They don't feel that they're listened to. They don't feel that they're supported. And it's almost that their sense of contribution or significance doesn't matter anymore. It's like, well, what have I done all of this time? What did I contribute? Am I important? And that has a huge knock-on impact. So it is about communication and giving those individuals that support.
Absolutely. And 20 years is such a long, it's a loss, isn't it? It's almost like a grief. Something's sort of coming out of your life that was such a big thing, and it is a loss. And you know, I think we've all experienced a feeling of loss over the last 18 months. You know, whether it was, you know, you can't come to the office anymore because we have all now to work from home, or those industries that could not continue working at all are going to be, you know, temporarily shut down, and you're going to be on furlough. You know, I think it's a big change. And you know, some people of course have sadly experienced grief and bereavement and loss in that way over that time. So that's really interesting, thank you. So in terms of, I guess, the you know, talking or relating it to grief or loss, I remember you talking one time about the change curve. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, Zoe?
Sure. And the Kubler-Ross change curve goes back to the 1950s. And as you were saying, it was originally the research and the information was around bereavement, around loss, and it's been adapted, and there's a variety of different models out there that have applied it to organizational change and personal change. I think the reason why I talk about the change curve is that I think there's two benefits to it. One is understanding where you are in the change curve, but also as a manager, understanding where your people are on that change curve as well, and that you have different people within your team in different places. You are going to have some people that are going to go, oh, this is so exciting, and they'll be at phase 3 looking at what's next. They'll already be thinking about how the future will look. They'll start to look for the benefits. They'll be seeing the benefits. And so you will have people who are going to go straight into phase 3. But you're also going to have people that are in phase 1 who are going to be much more resistant. They're going to feel certain ways about the change, especially if they feel the change is happening to them, if they don't see the benefits of the change, if they can't identify where they are in the future model. That has a big impact. So it's a real challenge for managers in being able to support a team of people who are all in a different place. And ultimately, you're trying to get them all through to phase 3, this acceptance and embracing the new model or the new way. But people are going to get there at a different pace and in a different way. And being able to manage that, this is what we were saying at the beginning about what we need from leaders, what we need from managers is really changing. And so being able to look at how you manage and lead your team, how you communicate with your team, how you support your team when they're all in different places. We talk about a hybrid way of working. It's a hybrid way of managing, of needing to be able to be a different leader for different people at different times. And that's a real challenge. And some leaders will be very excited about that prospect, and others are going to be pretty nervous about having to do that. And unfortunately, that's when people avoid it. And they try to avoid those conversations, and they avoid conversations that they think there might be conflict in there, and then it just snowballs then, doesn't it? So the change curve is a fantastic way of understanding where you are and where your people are, whether that's you as a manager, you can use it as a parent, of understanding where your family are or your friends are. I think it's a great tool to be able to look at that big picture and just understand that different people are in a different place, and we all get there in our own time, but we do need to get there in our own time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Even showing someone or explaining to them that we do go through this, when it can be a shock, it can be a shock to hear a piece of news that you're not expecting, and that you just to be aware that you're likely to move through various different phases is so you can understand yourself a bit more, and you can be kinder to yourself, because you can kind of understand that you're actually going through a process here of registering something, understanding something, and you will move through it. Super interesting. Thank you, Zoe. Have you seen do you think that people have got more resilient throughout the pandemic?
I think it depends on what the resilience is around. I think I'm definitely seeing a reduction in resilience around sort of social. Like that social element of being around lots of people. So especially for those of us who are introverts, the lockdown and working from home, not seeing people wasn't such a big challenge, because that's our comfort place. We're quite happy working in that way. But now things are starting to open back up again, and this expectation that we will be out seeing people, that socially, professionally, this level of engagement and interaction that is now needed. I think people's resilience to people has definitely changed. But there's also, I think, an increase in resilience around things like change, things like the things that we're not in control of, being able to kind of go with the flow of the things that we can't take control of, that acceptance that there are some things that we can't control, but identifying what we can take control of. So I think it depends on what the resilience is for. I think there's lots of people who have a tendency to look for the risks and plan for things. That's the last 18 months has really changed for them, and I've seen a lot of people who've learned to let go of that, who've learned to let go of the need to control certain things, because they've been in a situation which has really forced them to look at how they can respond to things in a different way. So I think there's been lots of benefits, but I think the resilience, I think it depends on the starting point to how it's impacted people. So definitely seeing increases in some areas and decreases in others.
Yeah, interesting. And I think as well with the control element and what you can and can't control, and just understanding that and being aware of that as well can also make you feel a bit more stable, I think. So thinking about, with the pandemic, there's obviously been a lot that you can't control.
Yeah.
There've been a lot of things that you can control in terms of your day-to-day habits and how you're managing yourself day to day. Also in terms of redundancy, I think it's perhaps looking at those opportunities, or any time of uncertainty, looking for, okay, well, this situation is happening, or the change is happening, whatever the change is.
Yeah.
What can I think about? What can I control? What can I influence, actually? What do I have influence over? And how can I express that influence to make sure that I'm still in the conversation, and I'm still being included, and I'm still relevant, and I'm still part of it, even though you are going through a change of some sort.
I think that's the challenge for managers now, isn't it? Is that we've had this period where the control has moved to the individual, of the controlling their workspace, their work environment, their working hours, resetting those boundaries over, this is my workspace, this is my work time, this is how I will manage life around that. And so managers have almost had to relinquish some of that control, because they can influence it, but they can't control it. So I think now there's a real opportunity to say, how can I support the individuals in my team to still have that responsibility and accountability over their workspace and their working hours, and taking ownership of their performance and how they manage their performance in and around everything else that is going on in their life, and not feel the need to grab back that control because they can. It's still almost staying in that circle of influence, being able to not feel the need to take control, but be a person of influence and support, and still keep the individuals in your team in that place where they are in control of making those decisions. It's that empowerment of people taking responsibility and accountability of how they work and how they show up for work. And as a manager, being in that circle of influence and support. But I think I'm seeing lots of individual managers who are like, oh, I can get that control back. So I want people back at their desks. I want people working in this way. It's not about you as a manager. That's not your role as a manager to necessarily make those decisions. It's about how you manage your team to make those decisions and show up, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is a huge opportunity here I think it's about trust as well.
Yeah.
If those managers that have been able to demonstrate trust, let their people get on with it, even though they're no longer in an office altogether. But to monitor the productivity through output rather than, time spent sitting at a desk.
And visibility.
Yes.
And trust is a two-way process, isn't it? You need to trust your teams, but also for individuals as an employee to feel trusted, to know that you are trusted to show up and make good decisions and be responsible. You will get more out of those individuals when they feel trusted. So it's keeping your ego as a manager in check, isn't it? You don't always have the answers. You don't always know better. Sometimes your people know better. And as a manager, it's keeping that in check, isn't it? And being able to take that step back and listening to what people are telling you and making decisions based on what people are telling you, not based on what you think you know because you're in that position.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I'm sure some people will agree with that, and some people will disagree, but I think that's management style, isn't it? Of you know, managing yourself in that position as well as managing your teams.
Well, trust is an interesting one because it also leads back into well-being, I think, because if you trust your teams and make them feel safe, you know, create a psychologically safe workspace. Again, as you say, you will get more out of your people at the end of the day, because they'll feel more able to be creative, to get on with their work without feeling that they're going to perhaps get the finger pointed at them or blamed for making a mistake. They'll feel able to explore within certain boundaries, obviously, and you know, you will have a more sort of productive, innovative, creative workplace where you will get, you know, more interesting results out of your people at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Cool, thank you. So you've talked a lot about communication. Are there any sort of, we're coming probably towards the end of the time now, so I'm just interested in some sort of last tips around improvements around communication, or any great practices that you've seen recently.
Key for me about effective communication is that definition, isn't it, of making sure and checking in that your message has been received as you intended. And I think that sometimes is the missing part, is that we feel that we've communicated effectively, but we haven't actually checked that the person has understood what we were telling them in the way that we intended. And so there's what we think, what we feel, what we want to say, and then what we actually say and how we actually say it. And then the person who you're talking to, there's how they hear it and how they receive it and how they process that information. And I think sometimes that is the biggest disconnect, is the one person communicates with very positive intentions in a way that they think is very clear, but the person who's receiving it doesn't receive it in the same way, and they process it in a very different way, and they might come away from that conversation with more concerns, and the other person leaves the conversation thinking, oh, well, I've communicated that really clearly. So it's that check-in that person has understood what you wanted them to understand in the way that you wanted them to understand it. But also listening. I think there's a big part of leading that is about listening. You know, we just talked then about the ego, about you feeling that you know more, that you feeling that you know best because you're in a position that's, you know, 1 or 2 bits higher on your organizational chart. That doesn't mean that you know more or that you know better. And so listening and understanding from your teams is so important, and not feeling that you need to know more. You know, I think that's a big part, isn't it, for especially when people are newly promoted, and we talk about imposter syndrome, is that people feel that they don't have all of the answers. That's okay, because you have individuals around you that will have the information and have the answers, and listen and understand and learn. You know, it's okay, even if you're in a senior manager role, it's okay to say, I don't know, I don't have the answer to that. Listen, understand, and learn. And that's a huge part of communication that I think sometimes gets lost in not listening. And I think, again, it's that you see it in managers where they're listening to respond. They're listening and they're already playing out what their response is going to be in their heads. They're not listening or empathizing or understanding. They're listening so that they're ready to have that answer. And I think that's, for me, is just such a big part of the effective communication of, you need to listen to understand. You've got an opportunity to learn from your people as much as they have an opportunity to learn from you. You don't have all of the answers, and you don't have to behave in a way that suggests that you have all of the answers. I think there's that vulnerability, authenticity of really good managers are the people who say, I don't know. What do you think? What's your experience? How can I learn from you? And use that information to make the decision and lead.
I think we saw a bit of that during the pandemic, because obviously none of us had experienced such a situation So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of, questions, going to the top of the organisation, and we didn't know, did we? Because this was all very new to all of us. We were all learning on a day-to-day basis as things happened. So I definitely saw a lot of that within organisations, and people just saying, I don't know, but we will keep communicating, and as we know more, we will certainly communicate it as soon as we can. And I think for some senior people that was a big huge change, not being able to sort of have all the answers and be the sort of most important person in inverted commas, because that's the kind of role that they're used to playing. I think that was quite a big change for a lot of people.
I think there's an opportunity there to look back and see how your teams have responded to that. How did your teams respond when you gave yourself permission to say out loud, I don't know, this is new, let's work this out together? How did your teams respond differently when you led and managed in that way? Because I think a lot of people will see that actually there was a real benefit to that they will have seen, that they would have had individuals who would have stepped forward and given suggestions and given ideas, and some team working and people working together to work it out, rather than looking at one individual to work it out for them. So I think that there's an opportunity there to reflect and see what did work, where was the benefit in managing in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, linking it to well-being again, so those leaders that were actually, showed themselves to be vulnerable, or I think we all had probably days where we felt a bit shaky, or we're not quite sure what's going on, where those leaders who said, well, I'm not feeling great this morning, but actually I'm going to go out and make an effort to go out at lunchtime into the sunshine or whatever, out to get some exercise, and demonstrating, leading by example. It's okay to have days where you're not feeling great, but actually, I'm going to give myself time, I'm going to make sure I take my breaks effectively. And I think leading by example is just so important, because if you don't take your breaks, then your team are not going to take breaks, because they will feel that they can't. That's the culture that you're sort of setting.
Exactly. And all of the research shows that when managers walk the talk, it creates that culture. So it's exactly the same as parenting. They're not listening to what you're telling them to do, they are watching to see what you're showing them. And that is so important. If you're sending emails late at night or at weekends, you are creating a culture that says that is how things are done. And so, schedule your email to go out during working hours. If it works for you to work later in the evening or work at weekends, that's great. But think about the impact that you're having on the other person. Again, it's the effective communication, isn't it? It's what is this telling them? What is this showing them? Not just what are you saying? So reschedule that, so you go, the email goes out when that person is next working, so you're not putting some kind of unwritten, unsaid pressure that they now have to respond because it works for you. And that's part of hybrid working now, is understanding what do individuals want, how do individuals want to work, and being able to adapt to that. It doesn't need to be a big ask. It's simple changes that benefit the person and the people that you're working with, and that will then benefit the business.
Yeah, I do think that's really important actually with hybrid working, that we can, because of technology, we can work at any time of the day or night, and being in our homes perhaps working or working remotely, it is incredibly difficult to maintain those boundaries. But I think again, to lead by example and set yourself healthy boundaries. With working hours, working patterns that you stick to, you're sort of creating a healthy expectations and behaviours for yourself. And I think also sending messages that it's important to put your health and well-being first. And actually I'm not going to respond to emails late at night because I don't, I have my working boundaries, and that's that.
Absolutely, so important.
Cool, thank you. We are sort of, you've been really generous with your time, Zoe. How can people reach you if they would like to continue this conversation or get some further help from you?
Well, more than happy to have a chat with anyone who wants to talk about anything that's come up. The website is a good point of contact, so phoenixlifecoach.co.uk, or I'm on LinkedIn. People are more than welcome to connect on LinkedIn and find me there if that's helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.